Hi everybody and welcome to a new episode of Diagnosedan. Today we're working on this 2011 Volkswagen Golf with a TSI engine, and the customer complaint is an extended crank time when the car has been sitting for a couple of hours. Now, I get a lot of questions on this topic about a lot of you folks, so I'm glad finally one came into my shop and actually got some time for you guys to videotape it. And in this video I'm gonna explain you guys how to diagnose this problem properly. And although this is a 4-cylinder TSI engine, the steps I'm gonna take can be applied on any TSI or FSI engine, and it doesn't matter if it's a 4-cylinder, although this one is. But if you've got another TSI engine, or for that matter any direct injected petrol engine, you can use these methods. So let's diagnose this together. Now before we continue, a little bit of history on this car, or at least a little bit of history that I know of. This car was taken to a dealership and they took some measurements and did some tests, and they scanned the PCM for fault codes, and they basically told the customer, this car is fine, we scanned the PCM for fault codes and there are no fault codes present. Now that is actually not a lie. I confirmed there are no fault codes present within this PCM, but about the car being fine, I don't think so. I actually confirmed the customer complaint, and indeed when the car has been sitting for a couple of hours, that initial startup takes longer than that second startup. On this particular car, it's not dramatic. The initial startup takes about 2 seconds. The second startup is within 1 second, but it is enough for the customer to notice it, and he basically wants it fixed. Now, another thing I know is that the timing chain on this car was changed. I don't know why it was changed. Was it changed because of this problem? Or did changing the timing chain created this problem? Or maybe the timing chain has nothing to do with it and we've got a completely separate problem right now. But because the timing chain was changed, I want to rule it out, and I want to confirm the timing of this chain and compare it with a known good. Now the reason I don't know why it is changed, because the previous owner changed it, and the guy who owns it right now only owns the car for about a month. Now to check the timing of our Volkswagen, I'm gonna use a scope. Now the scope I'm using is the GM scope. Now if you haven't heard of it yet, you soon will, because in my opinion this is the best product out there. Now I get a lot of questions from you guys about what scope I'm using and that you guys want to learn more about it, so I want to take the opportunity to give you a quick tour around the ADIS software, which stands for Automotive Test and Information System, and show you its capabilities. I also will leave a link in the description below so you can visit their website and have a look around. Now in the general screen, you've got a few options. Let's check out the first option, being the general scope option. When you select it, you get more options. The first option being engine management petrol, the second diesel, hybrid, brake systems, climate control, data networks, energy management, and the list goes on and on and on. Now let's select engine management petrol and you get more options. Sensors, actuators, ignition. So let's select actuators and let's select an injector. Now select the injector you're working on and it preloads the screen for you, in which it tells you how to hook up the scope, and you've got a picture of the component you're about to test. Now, if you click on the picture, it will give you a general description of the component and what to expect. Now, above this picture, more options: measuring signal, current, feed, or resistance. Now, let's select measuring the signal of this injector, and it will preset the scope for you, and it will give you a known good which you can turn on or off. Now, this is a great feature when you're not very experienced in using a scope. As you get more experienced, you can manually change the setting of the scope. Now, I've got the scope set up in Dutch, but let's see what languages are available. And there are a lot. Chinese simplified, Chinese traditional, Czech, Danish, Dutch, English, Farsi, Finnish, French, Frisian, German, Greek, Hungarian, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Latvian, Lithuanian, Polish, Portuguese, Romanian, Russian, and the list goes on and on and on. Now let's check out the second option in our main screen, being the brand specific option. When we select it, we get all the brands that are available, being European, Asian, and American cars. Now let's, for instance, select a Ford, and let's select a Focus, engine code, and the system you're about to test. Now let's choose engine management and start the search, and I've actually selected a 1.6 turbo diesel. So let's select it, and you get wiring diagrams, diagnostic measurements, fault codes, and the list goes on and on and on. Now over here, we can check the timing of this specific engine. So when we start the measurement, it loads a known good of this specific engine. This is what the timing of this engine is supposed to look like. And we can start our measurement and compare it to a known good by turning it on and off. Really, how easy can it be? Now, when we select wiring diagrams, we get a nice wiring diagram of this specific engine. And we can have a nice view, and next to it are the actual components of this car. So let's select turbo pressure sensor, and you get a picture of the actual component of this car. And when you load the measurement, it will give you the signal of this turbo sensor on this specific car. So this is brand specific, only for this engine, so not generic like in the other option. Now, it also gives you locations and pictures of where to find the components on this specific car. Now let's continue with checking the timing on our Volkswagen. Now in the top of our screen is a little option called History, and it shows you the last cars you've been working on. So I pre-selected our Volkswagen, and I get all these options. Now when I select timing, it tells you how to set up your scope, and when I select the measurements, there's actually no known good of this engine yet. But when you're doing measurements and you're absolutely positive they are okay, you can upload them into the library and everyone with this system can use it. And the guys at GMTO themselves are constantly measuring new cars and updating the library. But in this case, there's not a known good. So I actually called GMTO and they sent me a file of a Volkswagen, not a Golf, but a Scirocco with the same engine, and they send me a known good. So they never let you down. Now, in addition of using the wiring diagrams of GMTO, I like to use the wiring diagrams made by Hella Goodman, especially when I'm working on a European car. Now, our crank sensor B04 is connected by this white and brown wire to connector B pin 36 on our PCM. And our cam sensor B14 is connected by this green and red wire to connector B pin 53. Now, when you're doing measurements with a scope, always try to connect your leads at the computer. In this case, the PCM. In that case, you can be 100% sure the signals are traveling all the way to the computer. Now, in this specific case, I could have gone with the option of measuring at the sensors, because on this car I'm not worried about wiring integrity or a broken sensor, because when it runs fine and we've got no fault codes. Now, on this specific model, the sensors, and especially the crank sensor, is a pain to get to. So I went for the option of connecting my scope at the PCM, which lives underneath the windshield wipers. Now, I didn't bother you with filming me removing the windshield wipers and the air filter for easier access, because it's quite a straightforward job. Just let me show you how I'm connected, and let's start the measurement. Now, the PCM lives underneath the windshield wipers, so I got those off, and I got all the plastic covers off, and underneath the windshield there's a bracket, and you can slide the PCM out for easier access. And I connected the scope leads according to the wiring diagram. And as we're doing this test, you want to make sure that the VVT control valve is disconnected, because when the timing is off, the PCM can actually correct the problem by making the timing right again by shifting the phasers. So it won't appear when you compare it to a known good. So always disconnect those so you get the basic timing without the PCM being in control of anything. Now, let me set you guys up and let's start the measurement. I'm gonna start the car up and start the measurement, and the car has been sitting for a couple of hours, so please pay attention to the customer complaint of the extended crank time at initial startup. Now let's compare our recorded waveform to our known good. Let's bring the signals a little bit closer together. And notice how on the camshaft there are two narrow humps followed by two wider humps. Now on the crankshaft there's this timing mark. So let's take this point at the second wide hump and let's zoom in. And you can actually see how the rising edge of the second wide hump falls within the low spot before the timing mark on the crankshaft. So let's compare it to a known good, and the MTO was nice enough to send me one. I've got the file right here, so let's load it into the computer and let's open it. This is actually not of a Golf, but of a Volkswagen Scirocco with a new timing chain installed with original tools. So let's bring the signal up again. And let's take the same point, you see, the two wider humps. And let's zoom in again. And you see that the rising edge of the second hump falls within the low spot before the timing mark on the crankshaft. So the timing is spot on, and that is not our problem. Now, with the timing ruled out as being our problem, the next biggest suspect I'm going after is fuel pressure. Now, on this engine, there's a high pressure fuel rail being fed by a high pressure fuel pump. Inside the rail, there's a fuel pressure sensor. And what I want to do is connect my scope to the signal wire of the fuel pressure sensor and leave the car for a couple of hours and see what the fuel pressure is doing when the symptoms are acting up. Now, the car's been left alone for a few hours, and I've got the fuel pressure sensor back probe, and the fuel pressure sensor is located inside the high pressure fuel rail, which the injectors are connected to, and the high pressure fuel rail is being fed by this high pressure fuel pump, which is being run off the camshaft. Now, the scope gives us some options. We go for components, sensors, and let's scroll down. Pressure sensors, and we've got our low pressure sensor and our high pressure fuel sensor. So let's select that one, and tells us how to hook up our scope. We already did. Gives us a known good. Let's get rid of it. Now let's start the car and see what the fuel pressure is doing. Now let's take a look at the recorded waveform of the fuel pressure inside our high pressure fuel rail. Now this is our initial startup, and this is the second startup, but let's focus on the first startup, and let's zoom in. Now this is the point where I put the ignition on, and at this point I start cranking the engine over and the fuel pressure starts rising and rising and rising and rising and rising up until this point when the car starts running, and the sudden increase in RPM makes the fuel pressure spike, and then the PCM commands the fuel pressure back down to the desired level for idling. Now let's take a measurement of how long it took for the fuel pressure to build up and the engine to start running. Now it actually took 2.6 seconds, and that is way too long, so let's think about it. Now, I already saw what was wrong with this car based upon the measurement we just did. But to make it more clear to you guys, I'm gonna do a second measurement. It's actually the same measurement, but only when the car is not acting up, so when it starts right up. So let's do the second measurement and compare it to the first one. Now the second measurement with the car not acting up, watch the waveform. Now let's take a closer look at our second measurement. The fuel pressure inside our fuel rail when the car is not acting up. Let's zoom in again. And this is ignition on. Start cranking. Car starts up. Let's take a measurement again. And it actually took 0.6 seconds for the car to start running. Now, what's different of the previous waveform is that the fuel pressure is already there. The pump doesn't need to build fuel pressure, it's already in the rail. So when we leave the car for a couple of hours, all the fuel pressure is gone inside the rail, and the pump needs to build pressure again. And the second startup, the pressure is right there, and the car starts right up. So let's think about it. So you're thinking we're losing fuel pressure, and you are right. We are losing fuel pressure. But is that our problem? Well, no, it's not. It's normal for these systems to lose their fuel pressure within a few hours. The real problem is the time it takes the high pressure pump to build the pressure back up again. It takes way too long. Now, after a couple of hours, all the pressure in the rail is gone, which is normal because the high pressure pump doesn't seal 100%. There's always some leak. But the real problem is the high pressure pump not being able to build the pressure back up again fast enough. Now, this could be a problem with the low pressure fuel pump, which is not, because I already checked it. So the high pressure fuel pump is mechanically driven off the camshaft, so I'm gonna disassemble it and inspect it for any damage. Now I got the high pressure fuel pump out of the car, and you can see it's a mechanically driven fuel pump driven off the camshaft by a lobe on the camshaft, and there's a little roller with a follower that goes on the camshaft, and it has no visual damage, and the camshaft itself is perfectly fine. So there must be something wrong inside this pump. So what I'm gonna do is install this new pump and do our test again. Now I installed the new pump. Let's start the car up. Now let it run for a while. And let's put it up again. Now I want to make sure replacing the high pressure fuel pump was the right thing to do. And I certainly want to make sure the car is fixed before it returns to its owner. So, to be honest, I don't want to wait another 4 hours for the fuel pressure to drop inside the system. So I'm going to do a little shortcut. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to drain the fuel rail, and it's going to have the same effect as waiting for 4 hours. The only difference is it takes about 10 seconds. I got the fuel pressure drained. That's gonna mimic the car standing still for 4 hours. We're gonna do the same test again, new fuel pump installed. Let's see if we can notice any difference. Now let's take a closer look to the fuel pressure with the new high pressure pump installed. Over here, there's no pressure in the rail. The voltage in the sensor is very low, indicating there is no pressure. If there would be any pressure, it would be on this level over here. Now let's zoom in. And notice the difference. This is ignition on, no pressure in the rail. And when I start cranking, the pressure shoots right up. Now this is what a good pump should do. Now let's take a measurement of how long it took from the point where I started to crank until the point the car started to run. And it actually took 0.7 seconds. So I'm quite comfortable returning this car to its owner and telling him we've got a fix. Now any of the tests I showed you today, you can perform on any TSI or FSI engine, or for that matter, on any direct injected petrol engine. It's not losing the fuel pressure that's causing your problem. Now in the field, this should be an easy test. It should take you about 15 minutes. Just drain the rail and watch the fuel pressure with the scope, and if the fuel pressure builds within 1 second, you're fine. Now I hope you noticed how important a good scope is for a professional technician. Without a scope, I would never have fixed this car. Just looking at scan data is just not fast enough and not detailed enough. I would have missed it. So if you want to invest in the best scope that's out there, please visit GMTO in the link below and invest in yourself. Now if you like this video and if you want to learn more, please subscribe to my channel, and when you hit the bell, you get a notification each time I post a new video. Diagnosedan, fixed it again. See you next time, guys.